about that.
And I foolishly chased after him, not stopping to think about that it could be a trap. I saw him darting into a doorway and disappearing from sight. I followed, only briefly looking up to see a sign hanging above the door which read, Mr. Rashid's Newsagents and Grocers, and I noted the miniature flags, newspapers, and stacked cans displayed in the shop's window. I entered through the door and scanned the shop's interior, frantically searching for the boy, but not finding him. But by this time, Billy the Kid was the least of my concerns. There was something very wrong with this corner shop that quickly became apparent to me. The first thing that hit me was the awful smell, one of rot and decay. It was so bad that I almost retched, and then I realized I was being watched. I slowly turned around and saw a man who I guessed was Mr. Rashid, a middle-aged, bearded fellow of South Asian descent. He had a wide, unnatural grin, which seemed to be painted onto his face. This was disconcerting, but what really concerned me was the striped apron he wore over his clothes, which I noted was covered in bloodstains. But Mr. Rashid ran a grocery store, not a butcher's. The shop owner greeted me amicably, at least on the surface, although I could tell there was a sinister undertone to his words.
Good evening, sir. Welcome to my humble store. How may I help you today?
His greeting took me off guard for a moment. I struggled to find the words to respond. I saw a young boy running in here. He threw a bottle at me on the street. Did you see him come through here? Mr. Rashid shook his head, his smile never faltering as he answered.
Goodness gracious. No, sir. We don't allow troublemakers in this establishment. But since you are here, why not take a gander at our fresh produce and see if there's anything that catches your eye? I guarantee we have the best prices in town.
I almost laughed as I looked around the store's interior, soon realizing why it smelled so bad in here. Far from being fresh, Mr. Rashid's stock was in a state of decay. The fruits and vegetables brown and rotten, and the milk soured and curdled. In fact, the entire shop interior was in complete disarray, with the ancient newspaper yellow and crumbling, and the labelless cans dented or smashed open. Amazingly, Mr. Rashid seemed totally oblivious to the mess, smell, and general chaos as he continued to stand behind the till with that inane grin on his lips. But I sensed there was worse to come, a terrible secret yet to be revealed. The stench grew worse as I walked down the aisle and towards the back of the store. I spotted an ancient white refrigerator, which I guessed was out of order because my nostrils were hit by the new odor of rotting meat as I approached it. I turned to see Mr. Rashid watching me, a nervousness now evident behind his otherwise amicable expression. "Oh, what's inside here?" I asked. The shop owner's smile faltered for the first time as he answered.
Take a look inside, if you so wish.
I didn't want to open that fridge door, not really, but I felt compelled to do so. Reaching out with a shaking hand, I slowly turned the cold metal handle and pulled the door open, recoiling in horror at what I saw. The shelves inside were packed with rotting meat, the fridge's mechanism broken, and the meat infested with maggots and black flies. But as disgusting as the sight and smell was, this was not the reason for my horror and revulsion, because stacked on the shelves were arms, legs, internal organs, and a human head, its eyes missing from their sockets, and its mouth open and full of wriggling maggots. I retched, retreating in utter disgust as I turned away from the revolting scene, and I glared back at Mr. Rashid, whose face was now filled with guilt and shame. I continued to stare at him in disbelief, remaining silent as he uttered out his confession.
You have to believe me. I'm not a murderer. I never meant for this to happen.
He wiped the sweat off his brow before continuing.
I came to this country with good intentions, to start a business and raise enough money to bring my family over. But the pressure, the loneliness, it was too much for me.
He pointed angrily towards the dismembered corpse in the fridge.
This man broke into my shop late one night. I caught him in the act of stealing from my till. We fought and I guess my anger got the better of me.
He lowered his head, no longer able to meet my eye.
I knew the police would never believe me, so I vowed to get rid of the body. Please, sir, you must believe that this was never my intention.
Tears were rolling down Mr. Rashid's cheek as he finished his sorry tale. I was left speechless upon hearing this tragic confession. What did he want from me? Redemption? Absolution? I could give him neither. Instead, all I wanted to do was escape from this hellish corner shop, and so I looked past the grieving Mr. Rashid into the door. I feared he wouldn't let me go now I knew the truth, but suddenly there was a distraction as a half brick smashed through the shop window, showering the interior with shards of sharp glass.
Leave me be! Leave me alone, damn you!
I took the opportunity given to me, running for the door and darting back onto the street, leaving the stench and death behind me. I found Billy there waiting for me, soon realizing that he'd thrown the brick that had smashed Mr. Rashid's window. The kid continued to mock me as he ran down the cobblestones. I followed him, although I no longer felt anger towards the young lad. His brick attack had allowed me to escape from Mr. Rashid's shop, and now I wondered if he was guiding me down the street, acting like some kind of cross between a hooligan and a ferryman. In any event, I decided to keep following the boy, even though I feared where he would lead me. I watched as the lad dashed into a doorway halfway down the street, but I paused before entering, seeing the sign above the door which read, "The Bucket of Blood." The windows were frosted, and the swing door closed as the boy disappeared inside. I soon realized that, despite its unappealing name, this establishment served as the local pub house. A backstreet boozer of the sort you used to find all over working-class areas. Based on my experience thus far, I didn't know what to expect when I entered the pub. As soon as the door swung open, I was hit by the smell of tobacco smoke and stale alcohol. Not the most inviting of aromas, but certainly an improvement on the rot and decay in the corner shop. At first glance, the pub's interior was surprisingly ordinary, adorned with wooden fittings, neat little booths, and with a bar stacked with labelless bottles of liquor and beer pumps. The walls were decorated with old black and white photographs of dour-faced workers and their families, and all seemed to stare down at me in a somewhat sinister fashion. The bar room was almost empty, the only patrons being 3 burly men drinking at the end of the bar, all wearing dirty overalls and with hardened looks on their face as they sipped from their pints. They ignored me as I walked up to the bar and was greeted by the proprietor.
Evening, love. What are you having?
I looked to the woman serving me, a lady in her mid to late 30s. She was attractive, wearing makeup with her blonde hair done up in a neat bun. She wore a white lace blouse and dark skirt and shot me a friendly wink and a smile, her eyes green and passionate, although there seemed to be a sadness behind her welcoming demeanor, and I sensed there had been tragedy in her past. Nevertheless, I took the lady up on her offer, taking a stool and replying, "A pint of bitter, please."
Sure thing, love.
She replied with a smile, grabbing a clean glass and pouring my beer. "You're Sally?" I asked sheepishly, remembering the old lady's conversation.
That I am. And we've been expecting you, love.
"Yeah?" I answered in confusion.
Oh, yes. News travels fast on the street, and it's not often we get visitors from the other side.
She laid the pint down on the bar in front of me.
On the house, love.
"Oh, thank you."
Not a problem, love. But just remember, this is a local boozer, and we're a tight-knit community. We look after our own around here. Now, I'm not saying you're not welcome, love. But just make sure you behave yourself.
Her expression had become more hostile, and I could tell she was giving me a warning. I struggled to find the words to reply, but Sally had already turned her back on me. She diverted her gaze to a framed photograph hanging behind the bar. I glanced across, feeling like I was intruding on a private moment. The picture showed a smiling and happy Sally on a beach alongside 2 laughing young children in swimsuits, a boy and a girl. There was a tear in her eye as she looked upon the photograph, and I wondered what story was behind the picture. Just then, the pub door shot open and a newcomer entered. I looked up to see a dark-haired man dressed in work overalls, muscular and with rugged good looks. He grinned as he approached the bar, exerting an arrogance as he swaggered up to the stool and put in his order.
"Evening, Sally, my darling. My usual, please."
The landlady shot him a look that could kill before responding.
All right, Neil. I don't want any trouble tonight. Do you hear me?
Neil simply shrugged his shoulders, shooting Sally a wink as he said,
"Oh, you know me, darling. I'll be as good as gold."
Sally snorted, but poured him his pint nevertheless. I was getting some bad vibes off this guy and tried to avoid his eye, but Neil looked over at me and started a conversation.
Hello, mate. Neil Smith's my name. You must be this fella from the other side we've all heard so much about.
Yeah, that's me, I confirmed, wondering how every person, spirit, or entity on this street knew all about me.
Welcome to the neighborhood, my friend. Although I've got to warn you, it's bloody dead around here.
He laughed boisterously at his own joke while I smirked awkwardly. Next, Neil glanced across at Sally, who was once again staring at the family photo behind the bar.
Still living in the past, Sally. About time you moved on, I reckon.
The landlady shot him a furious look and spat out her angry rebuttal.
Go to hell, Smith!
She retreated to the back room, and Neil smirked cruelly. Are those her children? I asked, pointing up at the photograph.
They were. The poor blighters died in a fire.
Jesus, I swore, suddenly gaining some understanding of the landlady's pain.
Aye, was a tragedy, all right.
Said Neil, shaking his head.
I have kids myself, you know. It'd be terrible to lose them like that. Still, you should see what old Sally did to the lad who set the blaze. Oh, she got justice for the wee ones, don't worry about that.
He laughed again as he took a gulp from his pint. I saw a sour expression come across his face as he stared at his glass.
How's your pint?
Fine, I answered in confusion, although in truth I hadn't touched my drink.
Nah, mate, the beer is off. Oh, I'm sick of this piss water. I work hard all day to provide for my family, and this is what I get. Sally!
I was shocked at how angry Neil had become as he descended into a furious tirade over something as trivial as a pint of beer. The landlady stormed out of the back room, meeting her aggressive customer head on.
What is it now, Smith?
The pint is off. I want a new one.
There's nothing wrong with my beer. Quit complaining.
Neil slammed his pint down heavily on the wooden bar, spilling about a third of the liquid. He snarled his next words through clenched teeth.
Get me a new pint, you bloody bitch!
I gasped in astonishment at how fast this had escalated, but I watched on as the stone-faced Sally lifted up the pint glass, calmly lifting it above the sitting Neil and emptying the contents over his head. Once Neil recovered from his shock, he launched himself across the bar, reaching out to grab Sally's throat. I jumped up from the stool, thinking I had to intervene, but a moment after, Neil was grabbed roughly by a trio of drinkers who'd suddenly jumped up from their seats, and the men started beating the living crap out of Neil, punching and kicking him without mercy as his blood and teeth spilled onto the wooden floor. Neil screamed as the men dragged him to the back door, and Sally cried.
Get that bastard out of my pub.
I was horrified by the sudden descent into violence, but worse was to come. As a moment later, the glass window at the front of the pub shattered and a firebomb was thrown inside, smashing onto the wooden floor and instantly setting it alight.
Oh dear God, no! Not again!
Sally screamed as sheer terror overcame her. Soon the fire spread and the bar room was filled with smoke. I stayed low, coughing profusely as the smoke entered my lungs, but somehow making it to the door and back out onto the street. Of course, Billy was there waiting for me, but for once he was not mocking or laughing. Instead, he looked incredibly guilty as he watched the fire take hold. He saw me and fled, and I quickly followed, watching as he disappeared into yet another open doorway. I looked to the house number and saw it was number 13. Not a good omen. I stood for a moment on the pavement before a large figure emerged from inside to greet me, and to my surprise, it was a face I recognized. Neil Smith darkened the doorway, his previous charm gone as he cast me a disparaging look. I'd seen him beaten half to death, but now he didn't have a mark on him. What's more, he didn't mention anything about our previous encounter only minutes before, although he did appear to recognize me.
Here you are, then.
He said without enthusiasm, barely concealing the hostility in his voice.
You best come in, then. The missus is about to serve dinner.
I didn't want to follow him inside, as I'd already seen the man's violent side, but I felt compelled to enter number 13 and face whatever horrors lay inside. What I found surprised me, because I was confronted by an oak dining table where a family sat waiting to eat. There was a boy about 14 or 15 and a girl under 10, both bore a passing resemblance to Neil Smith, and so I assumed they were his children. The two children looked up at me suspiciously as their father took his place at the top of the table. No introductions were made, and I felt uncomfortable in their presence. My feelings of discomfort only increased when Neil's wife walked in from the kitchen, holding a heavy copper pot in both hands. She was a young woman with long dark hair and a pretty face, but she looked tired and bedraggled. Mrs. Smith reacted with shock when she saw me, jumping and almost dropping her pot. She nervously looked at her husband and asked,
Who's your friend, Neil?
Her husband glared at me as he replied.
He's a visitor from the other side.
Oh,
His wife replied, as if this one off-the-cuff comment answered all her questions.
well, you best sit down then.
I took a chair at the end of the table, watching nervously as Mrs. Smith opened the cooking pot, using a ladle to dish out a stew of boiled meat and potatoes. I thanked her as she piled the food on my plate. It did not look appetizing. The stew appeared to be made from offal and cheap cuts. Besides, the gruesome scenes I'd witnessed in Mr. Rashid's shop meant I'd lose whatever appetite I might have, and I was turned by the sight and smell of the meal. Thankfully, no one seemed to care that I wasn't eating as the family all tucked into their food. They ate in silence for several minutes before Neil abruptly spat out a chunk of tough meat onto his plate.
Damn you, woman!
He shouted aggressively, directing his anger towards his long-suffering wife.
I work hard all day and come home to this tribe. You can't bloody cook. Can't do anything right. Why the hell did I ever marry you?
I felt the tension rising inside the small room and feared where it would lead. Mrs. Smith winced at her husband's cruel words, but there was a spark of defiance in her eyes when she answered him.
Well, Neil, maybe if you didn't spend all of our money down at the pub, I could afford to buy better food.
I could have cheered after hearing Mrs. Smith's witty retort, but I'd seen her husband's bad side, and I knew he would react with violence. To my horror, I saw his face turn red with fury as he swiped his plate onto the floor and launched himself across the table, grabbing his wife by the throat. The young girl screamed and the room descended into chaos. There was no one to stop Neil's violent attack this time, no one but me. I desperately reached out in an attempt to hold Neil back, but when my hands touched his body, I felt a surge of pain run through me, and I collapsed onto the floor in agony, paralyzed by some unseen force. Meanwhile, Neil continued the brutal attack on his wife, knocking her down and wrapping his enormous hands around her throat, strangling her right there on the kitchen floor. I couldn't move and couldn't look away as the horror unfolded before me, but suddenly a new figure emerged with a blade in hand, stabbing Neil in the back in a desperate attack. I looked up in shock to see Neil's son, the knife still in his hand as his father cried out, releasing his grip on the woman's throat and spinning around. He moved to attack his teenage son, but instead got stabbed a second time in the belly. The blood poured from his wounds as Neil's huge frame collapsed heavily to the ground. In that instant, I regained control over my faculties, jumping up and running to Mrs. Smith's side. But it was already too late, as the life had been choked out of her. Her face a ghostly shade of pale, and her dead eyes staring up at the ceiling. Her husband/murderer was still alive, however, although barely, as he bled heavily from his deep stab wounds. He looked at me, struggling to speak his last words before he bled to death.
It wasn't me.
He spluttered.
There's a demon inside of me. But now I'm finally free of it.
And then he choked on his own blood and closed his eyes. My whole body shook as I tried to come to terms with the shocking violence I'd just witnessed. Instinctively, I looked to the children to see if they were hurt. What I saw was the crying girl being comforted by her older brother. He held out the bloody knife towards me, threatening me as he cried out in fury.
God damn you, outsider! You come to our home to watch our suffering. How dare you! You don't belong here. Get out before I kill you too. Get out!
I looked into the boy's rage-filled eyes and knew he meant it. And so I turned on my heels and ran out the door, soon finding myself back on the street. I felt an intense shame in that moment, because I knew Neil's son was right. I had made a great effort to come to this realm and see the horrors it contained. I was a tourist here, while they had no choice but to live through the nightmare. I looked to the end of the street and saw Billy was up there waiting on me. But the boy was no longer mocking or tormenting me. Instead, he remained silent, his eyes filled with sorrow. I noted how his scarf was gone, and there was a thick red mark around his neck. All of a sudden, the tragic stories of the street started to make sense. I continued to watch as Billy slowly lifted his arm and pointed towards a house right at the end of the street, directing me to its front door. Despite all the horrors I'd already witnessed, I somehow knew I needed to see whatever was inside and hopefully find some answers to this mystery.
The wrong turn.
And so, I cautiously walked forward, avoiding the wall of thick fog and Billy's dead eyes as I passed him and made my way to the house. The door was already open, and the number on it was 33. When I glanced up, I saw red smoke emanating from the house's chimney, and I believed this was an omen. I hesitated briefly before entering, feeling a cold chill, thinking that perhaps I didn't want to discover what was inside. But I forced myself to do so, as my whole journey had apparently been leading up to this point. I walked into yet another small, terraced house decorated like it was straight out of the 1940s, and proceeded to a tiny living room where an elderly man with white hair and a long, disheveled beard sat in front of a roaring fire, its heat warming up the small room. He read from a book, which I quickly identified as being a copy of the King James Bible, and by his side lay what appeared to be a full-size wolf, its white fur matching its owner's beard. He growled aggressively at me, showing him. I instinctively backed off, but the man calmed his animal with 3 words.
Now, boy, that's no way to treat our guests.
The wolf returned to its slumber as the man addressed me without looking up from the good book.
Welcome, friend. Please take a seat.
Puzzled, yet intrigued, I grabbed a wood-backed chair and sat facing the enigmatic old man, watching him carefully as he continued to read from his Bible. He remained silent for some time before eventually speaking, reading a passage out loud.
If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness.
He slowly nodded his head, appearing deep in thought before he closed the book and rose from his armchair. Then he carefully placed the Bible on a bookcase beside the fireplace. I glanced up and noticed other works of religion and philosophy from throughout history, including the Quran, the Vedas, and the Torah, as well as Plato's Republic and Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. There were many other works too, some I recognized, others I'd never heard of. I imagined holy texts from long extinct religions and perhaps philosophies from future civilizations still to come. I didn't know who this mysterious bearded man was. A deity? A spirit? Who could say? Regardless, I soon got the impression that he held all the answers I sought. The man saw me looking at his bookshelf and offered an explanation.
Humanity has many theories of the meaning of life and what lies beyond the mortal realm. Some are partially correct, others are very wrong. In truth, only those who have crossed over know the truth, and they're never coming back.
He smiled thinly, meeting my gaze for the first time. When I looked into his deep, dark eyes, I felt like I was drowning.
You've come far, my young friend. It's been a long time since a mortal made his way to this realm. I must congratulate you on your tenacity.
I was awestruck by the entire situation and struggled to reply, muttering, "Thank you, sir. And where is this place exactly?" The man snorted before answering.
You're a smart young man. I think you already know the answer. But let me elaborate. Purgatory Street, as you call our little realm, is something akin to a halfway house. The spirits living here aren't entirely good or bad. They all made a terrible mistake during their mortal lives and are now suffering the consequences of their actions, trapped in cycles of violence which repeat again and again. In time, some will achieve some degree of redemption, enough that they can move on to the next place. But sadly, others will be stuck here for all eternity.
"And who are you, might I ask?" I inquired nervously. The old man laughed softly before replying.
My real name is quite impossible for you to pronounce, and in any event, it's not relevant. Most folks call me the Gatekeeper. I sit here in this house of brick and mortar, which just happens to be located on the border between two worlds, and I do my best to keep the peace. But this isn't about me, young man. It's about you, and the decision you make next.
I felt a cold chill of anticipation as I realized something of great importance was coming.
You have two choices.
The gatekeeper continued.
You can turn around and go back the way you came, returning to your own realm, or
what? I prompted impatiently.
Or you can keep on walking through the wall of fog and on to the next realm.
I experienced a further surge of emotions in that moment, thinking my whole life had been leading up to this. What's over there? I asked.
I couldn't possibly describe it in words you could understand. The visions of the next world are something you must see with your own eyes. If you cross over, you will experience wonders far beyond your human comprehension. But there's a catch. If you choose to go over to the immortal realm, you can never come back. You will be leaving the mortal world forever.
I gasped in dismay, shocked by the implications of what I'd just been told. What should I do? I whimpered, no longer feeling confident with my choices.
I cannot make that decision for you, young man. You must decide quickly, as this realm will shift in time and space before the sun rises. Now, I'm afraid I must ask you to leave.
Suddenly, the atmosphere inside the living room became hostile as the fire crackled and the wolf growled at me. I felt unsafe, slowly backing out of the room as the bearded man shot me a parting glare. I soon found myself back out on the pavement, facing the fog bank which marked the boundary between Purgatory Street and the immortal realm beyond. My nerves were shot and my whole body shook in anticipation as I walked forward, ready to cross and bear witness to the wonders beyond. But at that moment, I paused, stopping dead in my tracks as my head was filled with doubt. Suddenly, I remembered my family and friends and my life back home. It wasn't perfect, but it was what I knew, while the other side was a great unknown. I had come this far, but was always confident I could return home. But if I took the next step, there'd be no way back. So, what can I say? I choked, lost my nerve, and turned around. As I walked back down the cobblestones, I saw the door to number 33 was now firmly shut, but the other residents of Purgatory Street were there to see me off. Billy the Kid returned to his rebellious self, giving me the finger one last time as he laughed in open mockery, only adding to my humiliation. Neil Smith stood outside his front door, alive once again, as he shot me an angry look with his fists clenched. Sally was cleaning the windows of her magically restored pub, turning to give me a smile and wink as I passed. And Mr. Rashid was sweeping the pavement outside his corner shop, that inane and half-crazed grin on his lips as he wished me a good evening. And finally, the two neighborhood gossips, Mavis and Alice, were standing at the top of the road, carefully watching everything that occurred on their home street. I looked up nervously as Mavis met my eye, saying,
"So long, son. I doubt we'll meet again."
I thought about her parting words as I continued walking, but I suddenly jumped in terror at a foul cackling emitted from number 3. I looked across to see the pale-faced demon staring out at me, its sharp claws scraping against the thin glass window, and its black eyes burning with hatred. I feared what the beast would do to me if it got out onto the road, and so I ran the last few yards in a panic. And with that, I stumbled back through the transparent portal and returned to my own world, instantly feeling a huge regret as I found myself back in the rundown neighborhood just as sun rose on the far horizon. I turned around and saw Purgatory Street was gone, replaced by the sadly familiar, rubbish-strewn wasteland, and my heart broke because I knew my adventure was over. And so, that's my story, and this is the first time I've ever told it. It's been many years since my visit to the street, and my life has gone downhill ever since. I've lost family members and friends, jumped from one unsatisfactory job to another, and have become unfulfilled and unhappy. I think back to that fateful night every day, wondering what might have been, and I regret my decision back then, realizing that I'd gone so far in my journey of discovery only to lose my nerve at the last moment. But it won't happen again. I return to that spot every night, hoping against hope that Purgatory Street will reappear and allow me to cross back over. I've had many years of disappointment, but one day, my persistence will pay off. I will walk the street again, and this time, I'm not coming back. Wish me luck, my friends.
I'm on 34th Street.
It takes 30 days to form a habit, and you can use Whoop's 30-day free trial to help you along the way. Whoop is a health and fitness wearable that gives you actionable feedback on a daily basis, coaching you right towards your wellness goals. Whether you're focusing on getting better sleep, starting a workout program, dialing in your nutrition, or improving your overall wellness, Whoop can help you. Through the journal feature, you're going to be able to track your day-to-day habits and then get daily insights into how those habits are either helping or hindering your progress. Like the old adage says, what gets measured gets improved. Try Whoop's 30-day free trial and
I'm not going to lie to you, nor will I attempt to justify my heinous actions. I am a mass murderer, a serial killer of the worst kind. Over a 20-year period, I've been directly or indirectly responsible for upwards of 300 murders. I don't kill for a cause or because I get some kind of perverse pleasure from it. Instead, I murder people for money, power, and status. I'll let you decide whether that's better or worse. The majority of my victims are officially recorded as missing, presumed dead. Their bodies have never been found, nor will they. That's close to 300 families who will never know for sure what happened to their people. I'm certainly not proud of what I've done, or for the carnage and misery I've inflicted. Some of the killings will haunt me to my dying day. There were ones who were largely innocent, guilty only of some minor infraction, or unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They're the ones I regret the most, because those people didn't deserve to die in such a horrific manner. On the other side of the coin are the real evil shits, the psychopaths and sadists, the members of rival gangs who inflicted their own fair share of mayhem and suffering during their time. Those assholes got what was coming to them, and I even took some satisfaction from their deaths. Nevertheless, after all these years and all the murders, they tend to blend into one. A montage of bloody carnage that's become a nightmarish blur in my memory. I tend to remember the details rather than the names and faces. I see those quaking bodies standing or kneeling at the pit's edge, often blindfolded with their hands bound behind their backs. Many will plead or beg for their lives, but it makes no difference. We couldn't let them go even if we wanted to. Sometimes we'll put them out of their misery before they fall, cutting their throat or putting a bullet in the back of their head. But more often than not, we'll shove them down into the pit while they're still alive and breathing. Our benefactor prefers his victims that way. The pit isn't as deep as it looks from above, and so usually the victim will survive their fall, although they'll likely break both legs in the process. My partner and I will stand above, looking down into the darkness, watching on as the injured victim squeals out in agony and crawls through the dirt, bones, and shit which covers the bottom of the stinking pit. Next, we'll hear the almighty roar reverberating throughout the connected tunnels and the sound of something huge tearing its way through. No matter how many times I hear that awful roar, I'll never get used to it. It's difficult for me to imagine the victim's terror in that moment as the beast charges towards them in the darkness. They'll have come expecting to die, but few could have imagined such a horrific final fate. The attack is usually over fairly quickly, a violent blur of viscera, the victim having never stood a chance. As I walk away from the bloodied scene, I feel some satisfaction that the ritual has been completed, and our criminal fraternity will enjoy continued good fortune and victories until the next sacrifice is due. No doubt you're confused and more than a little bit troubled at this point, so let me start at the beginning. I grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak. born and raised in one of the poorest and most crime-ridden districts in a city of sin. My father wasn't around, and my mother was an addict. So, in the absence of any adult supervision or positive role models, I was raised by the streets, learning to live by my wits and my fists. By my early teens, I built up a reputation as being a tough kid in the neighborhood, but I also had street smarts and was always able to make a quick buck. I operated as a cat burglar, breaking into homes and such, before I graduated to armed robbery. The cops never caught me, but my criminal exploits did gain the attention of the local mafia family. I made the potentially lethal mistake of robbing a liquor store that was paying protection to the mob. The local wise guys weren't happy with me, but my case came to the attention of a rising star in the family called Carl Guzman. Carl was still in his early 20s back then, but he already was notorious, his name known throughout the city's criminal underworld. He carried out his first hit in his teens and was regarded as one of the most ruthless and efficient assassins in the city. Carl's boss was an up-and-coming gangster called Angelo, a one-time low-level trickster and con man who'd risen through the ranks due to a combination of skill, ruthlessness, and sheer force of will. With Carl as his right-hand man, Angelo would ultimately eliminate all of his gangland rivals and escape any legal attention to become the most powerful gangster in the city, ruling a vast criminal empire incorporating drugs, prostitution, illegal gambling, loan sharking, protection rackets, and hits for hire, and just about everything in between. But all that lay in the future. Back then, I knew little about Angelo and Carl other than their reputations for violence. Now, I was a tough kid, but when I got called up in front of Carl Guzman for my indiscretions, I'll admit I almost shit my pants. I'll never forget that fateful night when I was driven out to an abandoned parking lot close to the docks and brought in front of Carl. He was a handsome and charismatic man, immaculately turned out in an Armani suit, his dark hair slicked back and short beard perfectly groomed. I remember his dark eyes looking down upon me, intelligent, but also predatory eyes. Carl was charming, but there was also a sinister undertone behind his words, creating the impression that he'd slit your throat without giving it a second thought. I was scared out of my mind that night, as I reckoned he would kill me right then and there. But, of course, he didn't. Despite my bad behavior, Carl was impressed with my criminal aptitude and the stories he'd heard about me around the neighborhood. Therefore, he gave me two choices that evening. Either I could accept my punishment for the robbery, which would mean a savage beating with baseball bats, breaking my arms and legs in the process, or I could join the family business and become Carl's new apprentice. Needless to say, it was an easy decision for me. It was only 2 months later when I accompanied Carl on my first kidnapping murder. This was a watershed moment for me, a real crossing the Rubicon situation. On that night, I sold my soul, and I do mean that in the literal rather than metaphorical sense. On that night of the abduction, I was drinking in O'Reilly's, a tough-as-nails bar on the city's south side, run by an ex-gangster who didn't ask too many questions of his patrons. I had just downed my second whiskey when Carl walked in. His eyes quickly scanned the bar interior as he sought me out. I could tell from the look on his face that he meant business, and this was no social call. I had a lump in my throat as I welcomed him. "Hey, boss, what's up?" He nodded his head solemnly, with intense eyes narrowing as he replied, "Finished your drink. We're working tonight." I knew from his whole demeanor and the tone of his voice that tonight's job was going to be more than your average hijacking or punishment beating. I realized right then and there that Carl wanted me to make my bones, to complete my first kill. I had done a lot of bad shit up to that point in my life, but I was yet to take a life. The prospects of committing a murder didn't exactly fill me with glee. I was never one of those psychopaths who gets off on it. Nevertheless, I knew I needed to make my bones in order to rise in the family, and so I was prepared to do so, but I had no clue what lay before me. We drove to the location on the outskirts of town in a stolen car, Carl taking the wheel while I rode shotgun. I carried a snub-nosed .38 revolver. Not much use for an extended gunfight, but handy for a close-range execution. Not a word was spoken during the 20-minute journey. Carl remained entirely silent and focused on the road. While I knew better than to ask questions, Carl would tell me what I needed to do when the time was right. We stopped at an abandoned warehouse in a desolate industrial estate just outside of the city limits. It was a location I'd never visited before, but one which conjured up images of gangland executions and buried bodies. Carl drove up onto a piece of wasteland, parking in the mud and waiting with the engine still running and the car's headlights illuminating the darkened scene. We sat there in the tension-filled silence until finally I couldn't take the suspense any longer. "What the hell is this place, Carl?" I nervously inquired. "Angelo owns the land in the warehouse. It's his place." Carl answered dismissively. I nodded my head, knowing that he hadn't really answered my question. I decided to push for more information. "Why are we waiting here, boss? I thought we had a job to do." "This is the fucking job!" Carl shouted back angrily. "Now shut your damn mouth and stay calm. You'll find out the truth soon enough." I didn't quite know what to make of his cryptic words, but I knew better than to ask any more questions. In any event, it wasn't long before I got my answers. A few minutes later, a second vehicle came into view, slowly plowing through the muddy wasteland and pulling up to park about 20 yards from our car. Carl looked on cautiously as the doors of the dark sedan swung open and two tall and bulky men stepped out. A pair of gangland enforcers dressed in cheap suits, both armed with 9mm pistols tucked into their waistbands. I didn't recognize the men, but Carl clearly did, as he opened the car door and stepped out, advancing across the dead ground as he went to meet the newcomers. One of the gangsters, a dark-skinned, bald-headed man, stepped forward and spoke. He apologized for being late, saying that there was traffic on the freeway. "You got the package?" Carl interjected abruptly. He confirmed that they were, and pointed to the trunk. "Get him out." A moment later, I was watching the two gangsters manhandling their victim, dragging him out of the trunk before frog-marching him across the wasteland. Their prisoner was dressed in a soiled tracksuit, his hands tied in front of him with a black bag over his head, obscuring his vision. He was an average-sized man, but dwarfed by the pair of hefty enforcers who held him. I noted how he hardly resisted his captors, apparently utterly defeated and submissive in his demeanor. Carl walked up to the hooded man, standing only inches from his face as he inspected the victim with a discerning eye. "Take that damn hood off his head," Carl instructed. "It doesn't matter if he sees our faces now." One of the men obliged, removing the hood from his victim's head. The face underneath was a sorry one. His nose was broken and his face covered in dried blood. His eyes were bloodshot and tired. Surprisingly, he didn't seem scared or in a state of panic. Instead, the victim appeared beaten and resigned to his fate. He adjusted his eyes to the glare of the headlights and looked up at my companion. To my surprise, it turned out they knew each other. "Guzman, is that you?" He muttered through trembling lips. "Yeah, it's me, buddy. Sorry we have to meet like this." Carl replied coolly. The condemned man surprised me again by shrugging his shoulders dismissively. "I fucked up," he replied simply. "Yeah, you did. Is there any way out of here for me? Any chance of a pass?" Carl shook his head in the negative. "Can't do it, old buddy. You know what happens when you steal from Angelo. There's no way back." "What about my body?" The man interjected. "Could you get it back to my family so they can give me a proper burial?" "Can't do that either, man," Carl replied with a hint of guilt now evident in his voice. "It's out of my hands. You know that. But we'll get word to your people. Let them know you're not coming home." I saw the condemned man's face contort and tears well up in his eyes. He took a deep breath before saying, "Fuck it. Let's get it over with." Carl took hold of the bound man, dismissing the two thugs while doing so. We watched as they drove off, and then Carl directed us towards the waiting warehouse as we led our victim on a solemn death march. It's fair to say I was feeling pretty disturbed at this point. In the years which followed, I became hardened to death and violence, and how the man meekly accepted his fate, this almost made things worse. I knew Carl was watching me closely and evaluating my performance. My whole future in the criminal underworld hinged on how I carried myself over the next few minutes, and I was determined not to mess it up. Carl made me hold the condemned man while he unlocked the door, leading us inside of the warehouse. The interior of the building was almost entirely bare, albeit illuminated by a portable lamp linked up to a generator. In the middle of the concrete floor was a gaping open hole in the ground, about 20 by 20 meters across. I was puzzled and more than a little concerned. Initially, I assumed the pit was some sort of mass grave. That would have been bad enough, but the truth was far worse. We dragged our victim forwards, right to the edge of the pit. I remember his whole body was shaking uncontrollably, and he couldn't stand without support. The stench by the pit was pretty horrific. A foul combination of rotting flesh and what smelt like animal waste, the same as you'd get in a zoo. I was uneasy, but also morbidly curious, peering over the edge, but seeing only darkness. "You don't want to get too close," Carl warned. By this stage, our victim was down on his knees by the pit's edge, muttering a quiet prayer through his trembling lips. I pulled out my piece, preparing to fire, but something stopped me from doing so. Suddenly, I heard a sound emanating from the dark bottom of the pit. Faint at first, but quickly growing louder. I jumped when I heard the animalistic growl for the first time, quickly followed by an almighty roar which filled the space. A moment later, what sounded like a huge beast as big as a rhino came storming into the pit. The ground was shaking due to its immense size and strength. I couldn't get a good look at the monster, only seeing a dark shape circling the bottom of the pit. I looked at the quaking victim before me, seeing him whimpering in a tear as a stream of urine poured down his trouser leg. "What the hell is down there?" I yelled, shouting to be heard above the creature's growls. "Shoot him and kick the body down there," Carl ordered loudly. I shook my head in confusion. "I don't understand. Shoot him in the head!" Carl screamed. I raised my revolver, holding the barrel against the back of his head. I paused before firing, not wanting to pull the trigger, but I realized that killing him would be a mercy compared to what lay below. I closed my eyes and fired, feeling the kickback as my victim's head exploded. His limp body fell forward, dropping over the edge. I heard the poor bastard's corpse hit the bottom with a dull thud. A moment later, the beast grabbed hold of him with its mighty jaws, biting down on flesh and bone while producing a sickening crack. As it briefly emerged from the shadows, seeing its shark-like eyes and huge mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth, the mere sight of the beast brought a cold chill up my spine, a primal terror unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. A moment later, the beast dragged the corpse back into the shadows and started to devour his flesh in a sickening display. I walked away from the pit in disgust, feeling like I was about to be physically sick. Carl gave me a moment to compose myself before he walked over, slapped me on the back, and spoke. "You did good, kid. The first time is always the hardest. Now, let's get the hell out of here." I don't recall much about our drive back to the city. I guess I was still in a state of shock, my brain still trying to process the horror of what I'd just witnessed. It was some time before I was able to speak, asking Carl the most obvious of questions. "What the hell happened back there?" I demanded. "I'll tell you what I know, but we're gonna need a drink," Carl answered. 10 minutes later, we were sitting in a secluded booth in an empty bar, free from prying eyes and ears. I ordered a double whiskey and downed it in one. "What the hell was that thing?" I asked, half not wanting to hear the answer. Carl took a large gulp of his own drink before answering. "I don't exactly know. It doesn't have a name. All I know is where it comes from. A tunnel leading deep into the earth. A passageway to..." He paused briefly, carefully considering his next words. "You believe in the afterlife, kid? In heaven and hell?" I shrugged my shoulders, puzzled by the question. "I guess so. I've never given it much thought," I answered. Carl nodded his head before continuing. "What about a Faustian bargain? You heard of that?" I shook my head in the negative. "It's a fable about a guy who made a deal with the devil," Carl explained. I scoffed and laughed dismissively. "I don't believe in all that supernatural shit," I replied. "Well, Angelo sure as shit does, and he's not on the side of angels. And how can you deny what you saw tonight?" I didn't have an answer. "I don't know all the details, but Angelo made his deal with the man downstairs a couple of years back. The deal was simple. Angelo offers up a regular sacrifice to the beast below, and in return, he gets everything he wants in life. Money and power. No trouble from the law, and all his rivals dead or in prison. The good times keep on rolling as long as he delivers the bodies." I shook my head in disbelief, wanting to believe this was all some kind of sick joke or type of initiation. But there was no way to explain the beast I'd seen down there.
My brain was racing 100 miles per hour as I tried to make sense of what I'd been told. I don't know, Carl. I've seen some shit in my days. Robbing and shooting people is one thing, but deals with the devil and human sacrifices? That's a whole different level. Carl nodded his head in understanding. I get it, man. I felt the same. First time I saw that monster and learned the truth. But look at it this way. As Angelo grows more powerful, we benefit too. A few more years and our crew will be running this town. And if the devil reneges on the deal, Angelo will be the one to pay the price. It's a win-win. So, what do you say, kid? You want to make it to the big leagues? I know I should have walked away right there and then, but what can I say? I'm not a good guy, and the promises of power and wealth were just too tempting. So, I said yes, and my life changed forever. Carl was right, up to a point at least. It did get easier over time. We carried out a lot of sacrifices in those early days, and it was around that time when Angelo went to war with the biggest crime family in the city, and the streets ran red with blood. Our boss was ultimately victorious, no doubt due to the deal he'd made with the man downstairs, but it was a long and bloody gangland conflict, and our hit squad was kept very busy. I can't recall how many men we killed during that gang war. The faces and names tend to blur after a time. We weren't able to sacrifice all of our victims to the beast. Many we shot dead in the streets, but where possible, we kidnapped our rivals and brought them to the warehouse. This wasn't always an easy task. Some of the men we took were real tough bastards who fought fiercely, but almost without exception, our victims would shit themselves when they got to the pit and they heard the beast's terrifying roar. Now, these guys were nasty. Gangsters, drug dealers, pimps, and killers for hire. But they were the worst of the worst, and I really didn't feel bad about serving them up as human sacrifices. Those bastards would have happily tortured and murdered us if the tables were turned. I'd shown mercy to my first victim, shooting him dead before letting his body fall into the pit. The beast preferred his meals breathing, so we pushed most of our victims down while they were still alive, hearing the crack of bones when they hit the bottom, and relishing their cries of terror as the beast devoured them. After a while, I feared I was enjoying my job too much, and so I had to remind myself of how horrifying this truly was. But those were good years for our crew. Angelo destroyed all of his enemies and took full control of all criminal enterprises throughout the city. The money was pouring in, and we became the most feared and respected men in the neighborhood. Soon, Angelo became untouchable, with city councilors, top police officials, and judges all in his pocket. Even the honest cops and prosecutors weren't able to build a case, and our boss never spent a day in jail. Yeah, those were the good days, and clearly the ritual sacrifices were working. But of course, it didn't last. The trouble was that we were too successful. When the gang war ended, Angelo no longer had any rivals left to eliminate. But of course, the devil and his beast were relentless, and they continued to demand fresh sacrifices. Before long, we began executing men and women for the most minor of infractions or insults. But the crooks were so terrified of Angelo and us that they didn't dare put a foot out of line, so we had to change tactics once again. That's when we started picking victims at random. They were people who no one would miss, the homeless and drug addicts mostly. We found it easier to dope our victims before throwing them into the pit. It made them more docile as we dragged them to their deaths, tossing those poor bastards over the edge and walking away as the beast ripped them to shreds. Carl and I rarely spoke on those nights, but neither of us were happy. I became sickened by my role in these senseless killings, a seemingly never-ending conveyor belt of death and suffering. I tried everything to dull my pain. Drink, drugs, sex, nothing worked. I just couldn't escape the immense guilt that I carried with me. Carl got bumped up about 6 months ago, taking on the role of Angelo's number 2. I didn't quite know how to feel about this change. Carl and I had worked together for a long time, and we shared a terrible secret, but a part of me was glad to see the back of him. I'd come to loathe the man who'd led me down this bloody path, even though I knew I'd ultimately made my own free choices. But the asshole they sent to replace Carl turned out to be a real piece of work. His name was Tommy, and he grew up in my neighborhood, being introduced to the criminal underworld from a young age. Tommy was the type of kid who tortured small animals for fun before graduating to do the same to human beings. He took a perverse, sadistic pleasure in killing, which had never appealed to Carl and me. We considered the murders an ugly but necessary act, and we tried to be as professional as possible, but Tommy loved killing and was almost giddy every night we carried out a sacrifice. He would mock our victims, laughing in their faces as they pled for mercy, or giving them false hope before delivering the fatal blow. Tommy was also obsessed with the hellish beast, almost to the point of worshipping it. He talked at length about every grisly kill, when all I wanted to do was forget. Working with a psychopath like Tommy made a horrific situation even worse. I knew I wouldn't be able to keep this up for much longer. Everyone has their breaking point, and I reached mine a week ago. The night of what will be my last murder sacrifice started out the same as my first, as I sat drinking in a dive bar, waiting for a call. Tommy rang me soon after midnight, saying Angela wanted us to work tonight. I sighed deeply while downing my whiskey, wandering out onto the wind-swept street where Tommy picked me up in a dark sedan. I climbed into the passenger seat, noting the cruel smile on Tommy's lips and the suspicious twinkle in his eye. His body language immediately put me on guard. "Where's the job?" I asked wearily. "The asshole's in the trunk," Tommy replied while laughing sadistically. "All ready for his little trip to hell." I nodded my head grimly and asked no further questions during our drive out of town. I assumed the man trapped in the trunk was just another nameless victim grabbed off the streets. Little did I know what lay before me on that fateful night. We reached the warehouse shortly before 1 a.m. I got out of the car and shivered from the cold, looking up at the stars above as Tommy opened the trunk to reveal the hooded victim within. The man inside was bound with duct tape, his hands tied in front of him. He wore what looked like an expensive suit, except it was ripped, soiled, and covered in dried blood. At first, he looked like just a typical kidnap victim, but something didn't seem right. "Get the hell up, asshole!" The victim complied, shakily pulling himself out of the trunk and managing to stand on his own 2 feet. I didn't understand. "What's going on here, Tommy?" I whispered in my companion's ear. "Why isn't he drugged? We usually doped our prisoners to make them docile and less able to resist." Tommy replied loudly, making sure that our victim overheard. "And that would be too easy, man. Angelo wants this bastard to suffer. He's going to know it when the beast eats him alive. Ain't that right, buddy?" He punched the hooded man around the back of his head, making him yelp in pain and shock. I didn't like this at all. Tommy was playing games, and I wouldn't let it slide. In an instant, I reached out and yanked the hood from our victim's head. I then recoiled in horror at what I saw. The bloodied and bruised face of my former mentor and brother in arms, Carl Guzman. I stood there, awestruck, looking my friend in the eye, seeing that expression of total defeat and resignation which I'd witnessed in many other condemned men over the years. He looked down, seemingly unable to meet my gaze. "Carl? What the fuck, man?" I exclaimed. "It's okay, old buddy. It's my time to go. This ain't on you, man." I shook my head in disbelief as Tommy pushed Carl forwards, towards the warehouse and his terrible fate. I ran after them, shouting questions in a state of frenzied panic. "Carl, I don't get it. How did this happen?" "I messed up, man," he replied solemnly. "Took a shot at the king and missed. Now I'm paying the price." I just couldn't understand. "But why? Why the hell would you do that?" Carl suddenly stopped walking, fighting against Tommy's grip to turn and face me. His eyes filled with a fiery intensity. "Because that son of a bitch needs to be stopped. That's why. Angelo and his damn deal. What we've done, it's evil. I should have stopped this years ago, but I was weak. Don't make the same mistake. That evil fucker needs to go." Tommy ended Carl's angry tirade by whacking him hard around the head and forcing him to continue his death mark. "Shut the fuck up, traitor!" the thug swore. I should have intervened to stop it, but I guess I was still in a state of shock, not truly believing what was occurring in front of me. But Tommy knew exactly what he was doing as he forced the helpless Carl inside the warehouse and frog-marched him toward the waiting pit. I followed behind in a daze, my mind racing as I desperately tried to come to terms with this unexpected turn and considered my next move. We entered the dreaded warehouse, Tommy and Carl marching ahead and me trailing behind.
I saw the pit and heard the faint roar of the beast as it tore down the tunnel, greedily anticipating its coming meal. I lost control, grabbed Tommy by